Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened about 10 years ago, but it is still one of the clearest and most unsettling memories of my life. Time hasn't softened it at all. If anything, the older I get, the stranger it feels, because no explanation I've heard since has ever fully fit what we saw that night. At the time, I was dating someone who is now my ex-boyfriend. Back then, one of the things we did most often was go on late-night drives. It was kind of our routine. We lived in a quiet area, and driving around at night felt peaceful, like the world slowed down after everyone else went to sleep. We'd talk, listen to music, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. That night was no different at first. It was late, somewhere between 10 at night and midnight. I don't remember the exact time, just that it was late enough that the roads were empty and the sky was completely dark. There were no streetlights for long stretches, just our headlights cutting through the blackness. This took place in northeastern Colorado, out on the plains. If you've ever been out there at night, you know how isolated it feels. Flat land stretching endlessly in every direction. No trees to block the view, no buildings, just darkness and open space. During the day it can feel calm, but at night it feels exposed, like you're very small and very alone. We were driving along the highway when we decided to turn off and pass through one of the tiny towns along the way. Calling it a town almost feels generous. Maybe 100 people lived there, if that. A handful of buildings, a few houses, maybe a grain silo, and then nothing again. These places are the kind you blink and miss during the day. At night, they feel even more empty. We drove through the town slowly, then came up to the spot where you turn left to get back onto the highway. We stopped at the stop sign, waiting to turn. That's when we saw it, right in the middle of the highway, and I mean the exact middle, sitting directly on the double yellow lines that divide the lanes, was something I can only describe as looking like a mangy wolf or a very large dog. It wasn't standing, it wasn't lying down. It was sitting upright, perfectly still, as if it had deliberately placed itself there. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it in normal ways. My immediate thought was that it must be a dog that wandered out there, maybe sick or injured. But even that didn't feel quite right. Animals don't usually sit in the dead center of a highway, especially not at night. They cross quickly or they stand at the edge. They don't choose the most dangerous spot and just stay there. The thing didn't move at all. Not when we slowed down. Not when we stopped at the stop sign. Not when our headlights fully hit it. It just sat there, staring straight at us. There was no flinching, no shifting its weight, no turning its head. It didn't seem startled or confused or afraid. It was just watching as we sat there, as we sat, waiting to turn. The uneasiness started to creep in. I could feel it in my chest. That heavy, cold feeling that something is wrong, even if you can't explain why. My ex noticed it too. I could tell by the way he went quiet and the way his hands tightened on the steering wheel. When we finally turned left, our headlights swept directly over the animal. That's when I noticed something that still chills me when I think about it. There was no eye shine at all. None. If you've ever driven at night in rural areas, you know that animals' eyes usually reflect light. Deer, coyotes, raccoons, dogs, cats. You see their eyes glowing back at you in the headlights. This thing's eyes didn't reflect anything. They looked black. Not dark brown, not shadowed, but black. Flat. Empty. The lack of eye shine alone was unsettling, but combined with everything else, it made my stomach drop. It felt wrong in a way I can't fully put into words. The longer we looked at it, the more uncomfortable I became. It wasn't blinking. It wasn't reacting to the light. It wasn't reacting to us at all, and it never moved. As we passed it, I kept expecting it to turn its head or stand up or run off into the darkness, but it didn't. It stayed exactly where it was, sitting on those yellow lines, staring straight ahead as if we weren't even there. Once we were back on the highway, neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence in the car felt thick. I finally said something like, "Did you see that?" And my ex immediately said yes. The way he answered told me everything I needed to know. He felt it too. That deep unease, that sense that whatever we had just seen wasn't normal. I remember saying that maybe it was sick or injured or maybe just acting strangely. I was trying to ground myself, trying to force a logical explanation. I've always considered myself a skeptical person. I don't jump to supernatural explanations easily. I like things to make sense. But even as I said those words, they felt hollow. The fur on the animal had looked wrong. It wasn't smooth or healthy. It looked matted, patchy, uneven, like chunks were missing or clumped together. The color was very dark, somewhere between dark brown, gray, and black. In the headlights, it almost looked like it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. What bothered me most was the way it held itself. Animals usually carry tension or alertness in a way that's easy to recognize. This thing didn't look alert. It looked deliberate, like it was exactly where it wanted to be. After we passed it, my ex didn't take me straight home. That alone told me how deeply it had affected him. Instead, he kept driving. He went into town, drove around for a while, took random turns, doubled back, and kept checking the mirrors. When I asked why he wasn't taking me home, he admitted he didn't want it to follow us. That thought hadn't even crossed my mind until he said it, and once he did, the fear settled in deeper. The idea that something like that could leave its spot in the road and trail us was terrifying. We drove around longer than usual, far longer than necessary, both of us scanning the road, the fields, the darkness on either side. Eventually, when enough time had passed and nothing else strange had happened, he finally backtracked and took me home. Even then, I remember rushing inside and locking the door behind me, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it sitting there in the road, unmoving, staring. In the days and years since, I've thought about it endlessly. I've read about eye shine, about animals that don't always reflect light the same way. I've tried to tell myself it was just a mangy dog, or a sick wolf, or some kind of wildlife behaving oddly, but no explanation has ever fully satisfied me. Most animals, even sick or injured ones, still react to cars. They move away from noise and light. They flinch. They hesitate. They don't sit perfectly still in the most dangerous spot possible, unafraid, unresponsive, and watching. What also stays with me is the feeling it gave me. Fear is one thing, but this was different. It was a deep, instinctual unease, like my body knew something my mind couldn't explain. It wasn't panic. It was more like a warning. I've replayed that moment countless times, the empty highway, the tiny town, the stop sign, the headlights washing over that thing and revealing eyes that didn't shine back. The way it didn't move at all, as if it existed outside the normal rules of animals and behavior. As cliché as it sounds, that experience forced me to question what I thought I knew about the world. I'm still skeptical by nature. I don't claim to know what it was. I don't say it was anything specific or label it with some myth or legend, but I do know that it didn't feel natural. There are things out there that most people never see. Places most people never go, especially late at night in the middle of nowhere. Maybe that thing was rare, maybe it was sick, maybe it was something science could explain if we had all the information, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I saw it. My ex saw it. We both felt the same unease. And 10 years later, the memory is still as vivid as if it happened yesterday. Some moments don't fade. They sit with you, quietly reshaping how you see the world. And that night, on a dark highway in rural Colorado, something sat in the middle of the road and watched us pass. And I don't think I'll ever forget it for as long as I live. For the past few years, I've been living along the north coast of the Scottish Highlands, in what is essentially the northernmost town on the British mainland. It's a quiet place shaped by the sea and the weather, where life feels slower and more exposed to nature than anywhere I've lived before. The landscape up here has a way of making you feel small, especially when the wind comes in hard from the ocean and the sky stretches endlessly above you. One of the most consistent parts of my routine is walking my dog, Maisie. Every day, no matter the season, we head down to the town's beach. The beach curves gently around the bay, stretching from one end to the other, and it's long enough that you can walk for quite a while without seeing many other people. It's peaceful in a way that feels rare elsewhere. The sound of the waves, the cries of seabirds, and the crunch of sand beneath your boots create a rhythm that becomes familiar very quickly. One thing I've always loved about this beach is the view. On a clear day, if the air is crisp and the sky is open, you can see the islands of Orkney sitting on the horizon. They look distant and almost unreal, like something painted into the background rather than actual land. Knowing that those islands are famous for their ancient Neolithic monuments gives them an extra layer of mystery, like you're looking at a place that has held secrets for thousands of years. On other days, when the weather turns, the view changes completely. Thick cloud or fog rolls in, and the islands vanish entirely. In those moments, the sea seems to stretch on forever, creating a false horizon that makes it feel as if the world simply ends out there. On one particular day, I was walking Maisie along this beach, as I always do. The weather was fairly typical for the area, not completely clear, but not fully fogged in either. The sea was calm enough, and the air had that sharp, salty smell that always seems stronger up here. I let Maisie off her lead, trusting her to roam without wandering too far. She's well behaved and usually more interested in sniffing than running. She moved ahead of me, weaving through piles of seaweed that had been dragged up by the tide and left behind to dry in tangled stacks. As I followed at a relaxed pace, I noticed Maisie suddenly stop. Her body language changed in a way that immediately caught my attention. She froze, head down, tail stiff, completely focused on something in front of her. Then she started pawing at it, nosing around with intense curiosity. I called her name, half expecting her to trot back, but she didn't move. That's when I walked closer to see what had caught her attention. Lying on top of one of the larger piles of seaweed was an animal skeleton. At first glance, it startled me. The bones were exposed and bleached white, the skull tilted slightly upward so that the teeth seemed to grin in a way that felt deeply unsettling. The teeth themselves were thick and flat, molar-like, and immediately suggested a grazing animal. I wasn't entirely sure what it was, but my best guess was that it belonged to either a sheep or a goat. That wouldn't have been unusual in this area. There are farms scattered throughout the highlands and across the water in Orkney as well. It seemed reasonable to assume that an animal might have fallen from a cliff or been swept into the sea, drowned, and eventually washed up here after drifting for some time. Even so, the sight of it made me stop in my tracks. There's something about seeing bones out in the open that hits differently than seeing them in a field or buried in the ground. This wasn't nature quietly reclaiming something over time. This was sudden, exposed, and placed directly in my path. As I looked closer, something about the skeleton didn't make sense. The upper part of the animal's body was completely skeletal. The skull, ribcage, and spine were picked clean, stripped of any flesh, polished almost white by time and water. But the lower half was entirely different. The hind legs were still intact. The hooves were there, solid and dark, and the fur covering the legs was still present. It was wet, dark gray, and clung closely to the shape of the legs beneath. As far as I could tell, the meat underneath hadn't decomposed at all. It looked fresh, or at least far fresher than the skeletal remains above it. That contrast confused me more than anything else. I stood there trying to understand how that could be possible. Why would the upper body be completely stripped while the lower body hadn't been touched? If scavengers had gotten to it, why stop halfway? And if the animal had only recently died, how could the bones be so clean and white? The two halves looked like they belonged to entirely different stages of decay, as if they shouldn't exist together in the same body. The longer I looked at it, the more uncomfortable I became. The position of the carcass made things worse. It wasn't lying on its side, the way you might expect an animal to end up after being washed ashore. It was on its back. The spine lay flat against the seaweed, with what looked like one limb extended on each side. The arrangement almost made it resemble something human in posture, and that realization sent a cold shiver through me. I knew logically that it was just the way the tide and the seaweed had settled it, but my instincts didn't care about logic in that moment. The image it created in my mind was immediate and disturbing. It reminded me of depictions of Baphomet, that unsettling image of a goat's head paired with a human-like body. I'm not someone who actively looks for symbolism like that, but the resemblance struck me all the same. The dark, fur-covered legs contrasted sharply with the exposed skeletal upper body, and the way it was positioned made the association almost unavoidable. It felt wrong, like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, even though I knew perfectly well it did. Maisie, sensing my unease, backed away from the carcass and stood close to me. That alone made the situation feel heavier. She's usually fearless and endlessly curious, but something about this seemed to make her uncomfortable too. We stood there together, the sound of the waves behind us, the wind brushing past, and that thing lying silently in front of us. I told myself over and over that there had to be a natural explanation. Maybe the upper body had been exposed longer, allowing scavengers and the sea to strip it clean, while the lower half had been protected somehow. Maybe it had been tangled in something, or the way it washed ashore created this strange division. Rational explanations existed, even if I couldn't immediately pinpoint the exact one. But despite all that, I couldn't shake the feeling that settled over me. There was a heaviness in my chest, a deep sense of unease that felt disproportionate to what I was seeing. It wasn't just disgust or surprise. It felt like a warning, like stumbling across something symbolic rather than random. I remember thinking, very clearly, that it felt like a bad omen. The thought came uninvited and lodged itself firmly in my mind. Eventually, I pulled Maisie back onto her lead and led her away from the skeleton. I didn't want her anywhere near it, and I didn't want to linger myself. As we walked on, I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting the image to change somehow, even though I knew it wouldn't. The rest of the walk felt different. The beach, which usually brought me peace, felt colder and more distant. The sea no longer felt calming. Everything seemed slightly off, like the balance of the day had shifted. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memory aside. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting superstition get the better of me. I've always been someone who leans a little toward the superstitious, but I usually manage to keep it in check. Still, the image stayed with me. It surfaced in my thoughts at unexpected moments, bringing with it that same uneasy feeling. Not long after finding that skeleton on the beach, my personal life took a sudden and tragic turn. I won't go into detail, but things unraveled quickly and painfully. Loss, stress, and emotional upheaval came crashing in one after another, leaving me reeling. At some point, the memory of the carcass resurfaced, and the connection my mind made was immediate and unsettling. The idea that it might have been some kind of omen crept back in, stronger than before. I know rationally that life is full of coincidences. Tragedy doesn't need a supernatural warning to arrive. And yet, standing there on that beach, looking at something so unnatural in its appearance, it had felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a sign, even if only in my own mind. With time, I've tried to tell myself that's all it was. Superstition. A strange but explainable natural occurrence, combined with my own tendency to look for meaning in moments of discomfort. Living in a place like the Highlands, surrounded by ancient land and unpredictable seas, it's easy to let your imagination wander. The landscape itself encourages stories, symbols, and interpretations that go beyond the obvious. Even so, I don't think I'll ever forget that sight. The white skull grinning up at me, the dark, fur-covered legs still intact, the way it lay there on the seaweed, as if placed deliberately. It's burned into my memory in a way most everyday experiences never are. Whether it was nothing more than an unfortunate animal carried by the tide, or something my mind turned into a symbol because of what followed, I can't say for certain. All I know is that on that day, walking my dog along a familiar beach, I came across something that shook me more deeply than I expected. And even now, when I walk that same stretch of sand and look out toward the distant horizon where Orkney sometimes appears and sometimes vanishes, I can't help but think about how thin the line is between the ordinary and the unsettling, and how easily a single moment can linger with you long after it has passed. So first, I need to explain how all of this even started, because without that context, the rest probably wouldn't make sense. I've always had this habit of watching horror-related content late at night. I'm talking about exorcism cases, paranormal documentaries, disturbing tapes, real-life horror stories, all of that. It's something I've done for years, and usually it doesn't affect me much. I get scared in the moment like anyone else would, but once the video ends, that's usually it. I sleep, wake up, and move on. That night felt different from the beginning, even though I didn't realize it at the time. It was around midnight. I was eating dinner alone and watching a full documentary about Annalise Michel. I already knew about her case on a surface level, but this documentary went deep. It wasn't just a quick summary. It showed everything: her seizures, her behavior, her voice, her family, the priests, the recordings. It was heavy. If you know her story, you know how disturbing it is. She was a young German woman who began having seizures and hearing voices. Her family believed she was possessed, and 2 priests performed dozens of exorcisms on her. 67 sessions. There are real audio recordings from those sessions, and they are hard to listen to. Deep voices, growling, screaming, things that don't sound human. She eventually died at only 23 years old from extreme weakness and starvation. To this day, people argue about what really happened. Some say it was untreated mental illness. Others say it was something supernatural. I didn't just watch the documentary. I also listened to the original tape recordings. That was probably my biggest mistake. Those recordings are not like horror movie sounds. They feel wrong. They stick in your head in a way that's hard to describe. Even after the video ended, those sounds kept replaying in my mind. The voices, the growls, the way she screamed. I finished watching everything around 2:30 in the morning. I told myself I was tired, that I'd just sleep it off. I turned everything off and went to bed. At around 3:30 in the morning, I suddenly woke up. Not slowly, not naturally. I woke up instantly, like something snapped me out of sleep. The room was dark and quiet, but I immediately felt alert. Then I heard a sound coming from my kitchen. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't something small. It sounded like something fell off a shelf. A proper noise, the kind that makes your heart jump. My first thought was that maybe a cat had somehow gotten inside, or something had slipped and fallen on its own. I tried to stay calm, but curiosity mixed with fear pushed me out of bed. I walked toward the kitchen, my heart already beating faster than normal. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something I can't fully explain. It was like pressure, like someone had placed their hand on my shoulder. Not a gentle touch, not aggressive either, just pressure, enough that my entire body froze in that exact spot. I turned around immediately. There was no one there. That moment broke something in me. Fear hit me all at once. Real fear, the kind that makes your chest feel tight and your stomach drop. I didn't check anything else. I didn't look around. I just ran back to my room as fast as I could and shut the door behind me. I got into bed, pulled the blanket up, and kept telling myself the same thing over and over. This is just my mind. You watch disturbing stuff. You're tired. Nothing is real. About 30 minutes later, I woke up again. This time, there was no sound, no noise to explain it. I just opened my eyes, and the moment I did, I swear I saw two faces right in front of mine, not across the room, not at a distance. They were close. So close it felt like they were pushing me upward. They weren't normal faces, they were dark, distorted, wrong. I don't even know how to describe them properly. It felt like they appeared for a split second, and that was enough to completely shut my body down. I couldn't move. My entire body froze. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out. And in that exact moment, my mind replayed that exorcism voice I had listened to earlier. It felt like the sound itself was waking me up again, like it had followed me into my sleep. I don't know how long that moment lasted. It could have been 1 second or 10. It felt endless. When I finally snapped out of it, I grabbed my phone immediately and turned the flashlight on. I needed light. Any light. Darkness felt unbearable. I started watching random videos, scrolling through anything that wasn't horror. I put on my favorite songs and listened to them for 10 minutes straight, trying to calm my breathing, trying to slow my heart down. I even turned the room light on, forcing myself to believe that nothing could happen if I could see everything clearly. Eventually, I felt calm enough to try sleeping again. That's when I started vomiting. He had been sleeping peacefully earlier. No signs of discomfort, no issues at all. Suddenly, he was gagging and throwing up. I had to get out of bed again, clean everything, make sure he was okay. While I was doing that, my nerves were already shot. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Every shadow felt heavier. After I cleaned up, my dog stood up and started barking. Not at me, not at the door, at nothing. Just barking into the empty space, on and off. Low at first, then louder. That scared me more than anything else that night. My dog never does that, especially not at night. Animals sense things differently. That thought kept repeating in my head, making everything worse. I tried to calm him down, telling myself again that this was all coincidence, stress, fear, overthinking. But even as I thought that, something else happened. I heard another sound from the kitchen. This time it wasn't as loud as before, more like a whisper or something moving, slightly, not clear enough to identify, but clear enough to be noticed, clear enough to make my blood run cold. At that point, I didn't want to investigate anymore. I stayed in my room with the lights on, my dog close to me, my phone in my hand. Eventually, somehow, I did fall asleep. When morning came, everything looked normal. The house was the same. The kitchen was silent. Nothing was out of place. No shelf was broken. No objects were on the floor. My dog was fine again, acting completely normal like nothing had happened. That almost made it worse, because how could everything happen at once like that? I kept replaying the night in my head. First, the loud sound in the kitchen, then the pressure on my shoulder, then waking up to see those faces right in front of me, then my dog vomiting and barking, then the sound again. All of it happened after listening to those exorcism recordings. That connection wouldn't leave my mind. I'm not someone who blindly believes everything paranormal. I try to stay logical. I know the brain can do terrifying things when it's overstimulated. Sleep paralysis exists. Anxiety exists. Fear feeds on itself. I kept telling myself that over and over. This is just my mind. This is just my mind. Nothing is real. But still, a part of me wondered, how did my dog fit into that explanation? How did the physical feeling of pressure on my shoulder fit? How did multiple things happen back to back, escalating instead of stopping? That night didn't feel like a single hallucination or a single bad dream. It felt like a chain of events, each one building on the last. Sometimes I think maybe my mind was already on edge from the documentary. Maybe I scared myself so deeply that my brain filled in the rest. Maybe my senses were heightened and every normal sound felt threatening. That explanation makes sense. It's the safest explanation. But then I remember how real it felt, how physical it felt, how terrified I was, how my dog reacted, and I can't completely shake the thought that maybe I crossed a line that night. Maybe listening to those recordings wasn't just entertainment. Maybe I brought something into my head that shouldn't have been there. I don't know if you can invite something just by listening. I don't know if it was all coincidence. I don't know if it was psychological or something else entirely. All I know is that night felt different from anything I've experienced before or since. It felt like hell, and even now, years later, I'm careful about what I watch late at night. Some things stay with you longer than you expect. Some sounds don't leave your head easily, and some nights remind you just how thin the line is between imagination, fear, and something you really don't want to understand. It happened about 15 years ago, but even now, when I think back on that night, the memory still feels sharp and uneasy, like it never fully settled into the past. It wasn't just something strange that happened once and faded away. It was one of those moments that sticks with you because of how real it felt, how deeply it shook everyone involved. It was late at night when my brother and his wife pulled into my driveway. I was inside the house when I first noticed them, looking out through the window toward the front. Their car was still running, parked crookedly in the driveway, and something about the scene immediately felt wrong. My sister-in-law was in the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. Even from inside the house, I could see her body trembling. Then I heard her crying. Not quiet crying, not sniffling or wiping tears. She was wailing, the kind of raw, broken crying that sounds more like a child than an adult. At first, my mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion. My brother and his wife had been married since high school, and they fought a lot. Loud fights, emotional fights, the kind that make you worry even if you try not to. For a brief moment, I honestly thought he had finally hit her during one of their arguments. That thought made my stomach drop. I kept watching from the window, trying to understand what I was seeing. My brother suddenly got out of the car. He wasn't calm. He wasn't angry either. He looked panicked. He slammed the door shut and ran toward the house, moving fast enough that I knew something was seriously wrong. He banged on the door and yelled for me to come outside. The moment I opened the door and stepped out, the sound of her crying grew louder. It wasn't stopping. If anything, it sounded worse the closer I got to the car. When I reached the driveway, my brother told me to stay behind the car. That alone confused me. Why would I need to stay behind the car? His voice was tense, sharp, like he was barely holding it together. He went back to the passenger side and told his wife to get out of the car and come inside the house. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She was curled inward, sitting stiffly in the passenger seat, her arms pulled up over her face as if she was trying to block something out. Her whole body was shaking violently. She kept crying and sobbing, her words completely incoherent. I had known her for years by that point, and I had never, ever seen her like that. Not even close. This wasn't normal fear. This wasn't panic from an argument or stress. This was terror. For several minutes, maybe 3, maybe 5, it's hard to say exactly, we both tried to get her to come inside. We kept telling her she was safe, that whatever happened was over, that she needed to get out of the car. She refused to move. She wouldn't uncover her eyes. She wouldn't look around. She just kept crying and shaking, repeating broken phrases that didn't make sense. Eventually, my brother lost his patience, not out of anger, but out of desperation. He reached into the car, unbuckled her seatbelt, and physically pulled her out of the passenger seat. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. He picked her up and carried her into the house, while she continued to cry and tremble in his arms. It was disturbing to watch. She looked like someone who had just seen something that shattered her sense of reality. Once we were inside, he set her down on the couch. She was still shaking so badly that she couldn't speak properly. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes wide when she finally lowered her arms, though she still refused to look toward the door or the windows. I stayed close, trying to calm her, while my brother took a moment to steady himself. Then he told me what had happened. Earlier that night, they had been on their way to an event. They were already running a little late, but realized they had forgotten something important. Back at their apartment, they decided to turn around and grab it quickly. When they got back to their place, they parked in the back of the apartment building, in the small lot near the rear entrance. My brother went inside to grab what they forgot, while his wife stayed in the car waiting for him. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She was just sitting there, alone in the passenger seat. The car parked, engine off. The area was familiar to her. They lived there. She wasn't expecting anything strange. Then she noticed movement. She saw a man near the back gate of the apartment complex. At first, she assumed he was one of their neighbors. People passed through that area sometimes, and it wasn't completely unheard of to see someone back there. But something about the way he was moving immediately felt wrong to her. She couldn't see his feet because the car blocked her view of the lower half of his body. But the way his upper body moved didn't look like normal walking. She said it looked like he was floating, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a subtle way that made her uneasy. He wasn't stepping forward. He wasn't shifting his weight like a person normally does. He was gliding, moving smoothly toward the back gate as if he wasn't bound by the ground beneath him. The movement alone made her uncomfortable, but she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the angle. Maybe she couldn't see his legs properly. The man appeared to be snooping around the back gate, moving slowly, deliberately, like he was searching for someone or something. She watched him closely, trying to understand what he was doing. She still couldn't see his face clearly. It was dark, and he was partially turned away from her. Eventually, her unease grew strong enough that she decided to make noise to scare him off. She locked the car doors and honked the horn. The sound echoed through the lot, loud and sudden. The man stopped moving and turned around. That's when she saw his face. According to her, his face was pale, unnaturally pale, almost gray. But it wasn't just the color that terrified her. She said his face looked wrong, like it was melted. Not injured, not scarred in a normal way, but distorted, uneven, with holes where parts of a face shouldn't have holes. She couldn't describe it clearly because she didn't want to keep looking. The moment she saw it, panic took over completely. The man looked directly at her, and then he started moving toward the car. As he approached, she realized he wasn't just passing by or reacting to the horn. He was coming straight for her. She started honking the horn repeatedly, violently, hoping my brother would hear it and come outside. She raised one arm to cover her eyes, too terrified to look directly at him anymore, but she could still sense him getting closer. She said she heard him at the car. She could hear movement right next to her door. She could hear something wet against the window. When she finally dared to peek through her fingers for just a second, she saw him licking the glass of the passenger window. He was pressing his face close, smearing the window with his tongue, staring at her while trying to open the door handle. At that point, she was screaming and honking uncontrollably. She was crying for my brother, but because of the noise and the urgency, he misunderstood what was happening. He thought she was just trying to rush him because they were late. It took him around 40 seconds to a minute to get out of the apartment and back toward the car. By the time he came outside, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere in the lot. No movement, no footsteps, nothing. His wife was hysterical, still honking the horn, still covering her face, completely inconsolable. My brother didn't question it. He didn't stop to look around. He got in the car, and they drove straight to my house. After hearing all of this, my brother immediately called the police. Officers came out and searched the area around the apartment complex. They checked the back gate, the lot, the surrounding streets. They found no one, no witnesses, no suspicious activity, nothing that could explain what she described. But whatever happened was real enough to her. They moved out of that apartment the following week. After that night, my sister-in-law was never quite the same about being alone at night. She refused to sit in the car by herself. She refused to park in dark areas. She wouldn't even talk about what she saw without breaking down. My brother, for his part, never tried to dismiss her experience. He believed her fear, even if he couldn't explain what caused it. I've replayed that night in my head countless times. I've tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it was a disturbed man. Maybe it was someone wearing a mask. Maybe stress and darkness warped her perception. But none of those explanations fully account for the way she reacted, the sheer terror that overtook her, or the fact that the man vanished without a trace. If I hadn't seen her myself, shaking, crying, completely broken by fear, I might have written it off as hysteria. If my brother hadn't been there, hadn't heard the horn, hadn't seen how quickly everything escalated, I might have doubted it too. But I saw her that night. I heard her cries. I watched a grown adult reduced to a state of pure terror. Whatever she saw, it wasn't just in her head. To this day, I don't claim it was a ghost. I don't say it was something supernatural with certainty, but I also can't say it was normal. Something happened that night that none of us could explain, something that frightened her deeply enough to change her behavior and force them to uproot their lives. And 15 years later, it still sends a chill through me when I think about it. I still remember that night with unsettling clarity, even though so many years have passed. At the time, I was about 13 years old, still young enough that the house felt safe simply because it was familiar, but old enough to start noticing when something felt wrong. A close friend was over at my place, and my parents had gone out for the evening. That wasn't unusual. They trusted me, and nothing like this had ever happened before. We were just doing what kids our age did, sitting on the couch, playing video games, laughing, completely relaxed and unaware that the night would end up burned into my memory. The house felt normal at first. Lights were on, the TV was making noise, controllers clicking in our hands. Outside, it was already dark, but that didn't matter much. We were inside, distracted, comfortable. At some point during the night, while we were still playing, I heard a loud sound. It was sharp and heavy, like a large piece of metal being dropped or slammed against something solid. It echoed through the house in a way that made me pause for a second. but I didn't really think about it too much. Houses make noises, pipes shift, things settle, and sometimes you hear sounds you can't explain right away. I shrugged it off and went back to the game. Looking back now, that was probably the first warning sign, but at the time it didn't register as anything serious. About an hour later, we weren't playing anymore. The game was paused and we were just sitting there talking, joking around the way kids do when they've run out of things to do but don't want the night to end yet. That's when I heard something again. This time, it was different. It wasn't loud. It was subtle. Strange enough that my brain didn't immediately categorize it as a normal house sound. I remember telling my friend to shut up because I wanted to hear it better. He kept talking, laughing, not realizing how serious I was. I snapped at him, louder and more aggressive than I meant to, telling him to shut the hell up. The moment he went quiet, the sound became clearer. It sounded like whispers, not whispers right next to us, but distant, coming from below. From the basement, it wasn't a single voice. It sounded like two people, maybe more, arguing quietly. The tone was tense, urgent, like they were trying not to be heard. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was unmistakably voices. My entire body went cold. I didn't say anything. I didn't even look at my friend right away. I just sat there, frozen, listening. Then I looked at him. The look on his face told me everything. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, his whole expression stiff with fear. He was hearing it too. In that moment, the realization hit me hard and fast. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't my brain playing tricks on me. Whatever that sound was, it was real. That's when my mind jumped back to the loud metal bang I'd heard earlier in the night. Suddenly, it made sense in the worst possible way. My house had an outside metal door that led into the basement. That sound could have easily been that door slamming open or shut. The pieces clicked together instantly and my fear skyrocketed. I became absolutely convinced that people had broken into my house and were now down in the basement, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what to do next. There was no hesitation, no discussion. Fear took over completely. We bolted. We ran out the back door as fast as we could. I don't even remember grabbing shoes or jackets. I don't remember locking anything. All I remember is running. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My legs burning, breath coming out in panicked gasps. The world narrowed down to one thought: get away. My grandparents lived down the street, close enough that I could reach their house without stopping, but far enough that it felt like a desperate sprint. I didn't slow down until I reached their door. I was shaking when I knocked, barely able to explain what was happening when they opened it. They let us in immediately, and that's when the adrenaline started to crash, and the fear really set in. I used their phone to call my parents. My voice was shaky, words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain. I told them about the noise, the whispers, the basement. I told them I thought someone had broken into the house. They didn't question it. They told me to stay put and said they were coming home right away. The wait felt endless. When my parents arrived, they went straight back to the house. My friend and I stayed behind with my grandparents, replaying the sounds over and over in our heads. Every time the phone rang or a car passed outside, my heart jumped. I kept imagining people hiding in the basement, waiting, listening. Eventually, my parents came back. They told us they had searched the entire house. Every room, every closet, the basement. There was no one there. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The outside metal door to the basement was still locked, just like it always was. No signs of forced entry, no open doors, no explanation. Hearing that didn't bring relief the way I expected it to. Instead, it made everything feel worse. If no one had broken in, then what did we hear? To this day, I still don't know. I still don't have an explanation that fully makes sense. Houses can make noises, sure, but houses don't whisper. They don't sound like two people quietly arguing. And the fact that my friend heard it too is what keeps this memory so firmly planted in my mind. If I had been alone, I could have convinced myself that I imagined it, that I was scared, bored, or overly imaginative. But I wasn't alone. We both heard it. That night scared me in a way few things ever have. It wasn't just fear of burglars or danger. It was the fear of not understanding what was happening, of realizing that sometimes things occur that don't fit neatly into logic. For a long time after that, I hated being home alone at night. Every small noise made my stomach drop. Every creak or thump made me think of that whispering sound drifting up from the basement. Even now, years later, the memory hasn't faded. I can still picture the living room, the couch, the TV paused on the screen. I can still hear the way the whispers sounded low and urgent, just out of reach. I can still feel the rush of fear when my friend went silent and I realized he was hearing the same thing. I don't claim to know what it was. I don't pretend to have a paranormal explanation or a rational one that ties everything up nicely. All I know is that something happened that night. Something real enough to send two 13-year-old kids running for their lives. And that's what makes it so hard to forget. This happened a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3, possibly 4. The exact year doesn't matter much because the memory is still very clear in my head. At the time, I was in my first year of a photography course at college, still adjusting to late nights, deadlines, and the kind of routine where staying up until early morning hours felt normal. That night was no different, at least not at first. It was around 1 in the morning. I was in my room working on something photography related, editing photos or sorting files with my headphones on. Music was playing quietly, enough to block out small background noises, but not loud enough to completely disconnect me from the house. My mom often fell asleep on the sofa downstairs and then went up to bed late, sometimes after midnight, sometimes closer to 1 or 2 in the morning. Because of that, hearing movement in the house at that hour didn't immediately feel strange. At some point, I heard rustling coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone moving around, maybe opening drawers or picking things up. My first thought was that my mom was still awake and looking for something before going to bed. I didn't think much of it. Houses make noise, and when you live somewhere long enough, you stop questioning every sound. But after a few moments, the noise seemed closer to the stairs. That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy, not panicked, not scared, just that slight feeling that something didn't quite line up. I took one ear cup off my headphones and listened more closely. The sounds weren't frantic, but they didn't sound casual either. Still, my brain kept trying to explain it away. Mom looking for her phone, Mom grabbing a charger, Mom checking something before heading upstairs. Then my dad came out of the bathroom. He looked at me and asked, casually at first, if I was in my room. I said yes. The moment those words left my mouth, something changed in his expression. He went quiet for half a second, then told me to come with him downstairs. There was urgency in his voice, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you even know why. We both moved quickly, almost running down the stairs. As soon as we reached the bottom, it became obvious what had happened. One of the windows had been forced open. The latch was damaged, the frame bent just enough to let someone inside. That was when everything clicked at once. My mom had gone upstairs to bed around midnight. Whoever broke in must have been watching, waiting for her to go to sleep before making a move. Someone had been inside our house while we were all home. The reality of that hit harder than any horror story ever could. The guy didn't take everything. He wasn't smashing the place up or making a mess. He took specific things, my wallet, my dad's work laptop, my mom's Kindle, Things that were easy to grab and easy to carry. At first, it felt like a standard burglary, frightening but straightforward. Then, my dad noticed something that made the whole situation far more disturbing. We had a katana on a stand in the house. It wasn't just decorative, it was real, sharp, and something my dad took seriously. The thief had taken one of the katanas off the stand and left it nearby, like he'd been holding it or keeping it ready. That detail changed everything. The idea that someone had been inside our house, armed, waiting in case one of us came downstairs. That was the moment it really sank in how bad things could have been. I'm generally a laid-back person. I don't panic easily. Even when something dangerous happens, my first reaction isn't fear, it's more like detached awareness. But this wasn't about being scared in the moment. It was the realization afterward. If I had gone downstairs when I heard those noises, thinking it was my mom, I could have walked straight into him. I'm quiet on the stairs. I don't stomp. I don't announce myself. If he was already holding that katana, ready to attack, I might not have even had time to react. It didn't scare me so much as it hit me with a delayed understanding, like you could have died, not dramatically, not in some movie-like struggle, just instantly because you assumed the house was safe. My dad didn't waste time. Once he realized the guy had already left, he grabbed his phone and went outside, looking around the area. He was angry, focused, and running on adrenaline. At some point, he actually bumped into the guy while he was on the phone. The timing was unreal. The thief was carrying fishing gear. Apparently, he had stolen it from one of our neighbors. When my dad questioned him, the guy claimed he was out late-night fishing. With the fishing rods and equipment in hand, the story almost made sense. Enough that my dad didn't immediately tackle him or escalate things further right there. The guy walked off and my dad came back home. The police were called, statements were given. The usual process started. At that point, we assumed the stolen items were gone for good. Annoying, upsetting, but not unexpected. Then came the part that still feels almost darkly funny in hindsight. My dad's work laptop was heavily password protected. Not just a basic login, but serious security. A few days after the break-in, after the police had already been informed, my dad went to a place where one of his friends worked. It was a local business, the kind of place where people sometimes bought and sold secondhand electronics. And there it was, his laptop, sitting right there. My dad was obviously confused, thinking maybe it just looked similar, but his friend pulled him aside and explained what had happened. Apparently a guy had come in trying to sell the laptop. When he realized he couldn't get into it or wipe it properly, he just wanted quick cash and didn't care anymore. My dad's friend recognized something was off and kept it. With that information, my dad went straight back to the police. His friend acted as a witness, confirming who sold it and when. That was enough to move things forward properly. The thief was eventually caught. From what we later heard, the situation didn't end well for him, even after arrest. Word got around that he'd been selling stolen items, and apparently he ended up with a kind of bounty on his head inside prison. People don't take kindly to that sort of thing. There were rumors that he tried to take his own life because of it. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if he's still in prison or if he's been released. I've never looked into it further, and honestly, I don't care to. At some point, his father contacted my dad's friend and wanted to talk to us. We never found out exactly why. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he wanted us not to press charges or to offer compensation. Whatever the reason, my dad refused outright. He didn't want anyone giving out our address or involving us any further. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure if my dad had come face to face with that guy again, it would not have ended well. There's one small detail about that night that still makes me shake my head. Earlier in the evening, I had left my camera bag downstairs. It held my camera, lenses, and equipment I needed for my course. It wasn't cheap. It was the most important thing I owned at the time. My dad noticed it and absolutely tore into me for leaving it down there. He kept telling me to take it upstairs, saying I was careless and that something could happen to it. I was annoyed. I thought he was overreacting, but I took it upstairs anyway. If I hadn't, that camera would have been stolen too, and losing it would have completely screwed me. I wouldn't have been able to continue my course properly, and I would have lost a lot of money on equipment I no longer had. That small, almost insignificant argument probably saved my entire year. That night changed how I see safety, not in a paranoid way, but in a realistic one. It taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sounds like rustling. Sometimes it sounds like someone you trust moving around the house. And sometimes the difference between a normal night and a life-changing one is as small as whether you decide to investigate a noise or stay where you are. There's humor in parts of the story, sure, but underneath it, there's still that quiet, unsettling thought that lingers. Someone was inside our house, armed, waiting, and by pure chance, timing, and one annoyed parent, things didn't go a very different way. That's the part that stays with you. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. Back when I was about 12 years old, my family took a trip out into rural Victoria in Australia to see my grandpa play at a bluegrass festival. It was supposed to be a fun family getaway, something relaxed and memorable. My grandpa had been playing music for years, and this festival was a big deal for him, so we all made the effort to go. At that age, I didn't fully appreciate the music or the atmosphere the way adults did, but I was excited to get away from home and stay somewhere new. My parents, my brother, and I stayed in a caravan park in a very small town called Freeburg. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. Quiet, surrounded by bushland, and with that feeling of being far away from everything familiar. My grandparents, along with a friend of theirs from Holland, stayed in a nearby town called Harrietville. It wasn't far away, just enough distance that we weren't all crammed into the same place. We didn't own a caravan ourselves, so instead we rented a cabin at the caravan park. I remember being pleasantly surprised by it at first. From the outside, it looked fairly new and well kept. Inside, it was small and a bit cramped, but not uncomfortable. Most of the furniture looked like old, cheap motel furniture, the kind that's sturdy but lifeless, clearly chosen more for durability than comfort. Still, I liked the place. It felt like a proper holiday cabin, different enough from home to be exciting, except for one room. My parents' room gave me the creeps from the moment we arrived. To this day, I can't fully explain why. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. It wasn't filthy or damaged. It wasn't darker than the other rooms or filled with strange decorations. If anything, it looked fairly normal. The furniture in that room did seem slightly older than what was in the rest of the cabin, but not enough that it should have stood out. It was still cozy, still functional, still just a bedroom. But 12-year-old me knew something was wrong with it. It wasn't a sudden fear. It was more like a constant low-level unease that never went away. Every time I walked past that room, my stomach tightened just a little. I avoided looking into it for too long. When I brushed my teeth at night, I would angle myself so I could see the doorway to my parents' room reflected in the mirror. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. It was just instinct, like some part of my brain needed to keep an eye on it. Even when I was having a bath in the jacuzzi for the first time, something that should have been exciting and relaxing, I found myself barely taking my eyes off that room. I'd glance toward it again and again, half expecting something to happen, though I had no idea what that something might be. There was never any movement, never any sound coming from it, but that somehow made it worse. What's strange is that even now, years later, when I think back to that cabin, my parents' room, unsettles me more than the actual paranormal experience I had there. The memory of that room carries a heavier sense of fear than the event itself, like the room was quietly watching everything that happened. The main incident happened one night during our stay. That evening I got into an argument with my mother in the lounge room. I don't even remember what it was about now. Probably something trivial, the kind of argument that feels huge when you're a kid, but meaningless in hindsight. Voices were raised, emotions were high, and eventually I stormed off to my room. My bedroom was right next to my parents' room, separated only by a thin wall. Even though I was angry, I didn't slam my door. I remember consciously closing it gently because I didn't want to make my mother angrier than she already was. I lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still racing from the argument, and I was replaying everything in my head, like kids do when they're upset. Then it happened. There was a massive bang on my door. Not a knock, not a thump. A bang so loud and forceful that I genuinely thought the door was going to break. The entire door shook in its frame. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and violent. I sat straight up in bed, my heart instantly jumping into my throat. My immediate thought was that my mother had come after me, angry, and had kicked the door as hard as she could. That was the only explanation my mind could come up with in that split second. But even as that thought formed, it didn't quite make sense. My mother isn't a large or particularly physical woman. She's not someone who kicks doors or lashes out like that. The force behind that bang felt far beyond anything she could reasonably do. I knew it couldn't have been a punch either. If someone had punched the door hard enough to make it shake the way it did, they would have broken their knuckles. And the hallway was far too narrow for someone to have rammed it with their shoulder or body. There just wasn't enough space. Still shaken, I called out and asked my mother if she had kicked the door. She answered from the lounge room, sounding just as confused as I felt. She asked if I had kicked it. That's when the fear really set in. I told her no, I hadn't touched the door. There was a brief pause on her end. I could hear hesitation in her voice. Then she said something about how old houses sometimes do weird things, how wood can expand or shift, and she sort of trailed off mid-sentence. I believed her. I was 12, naive, and I trusted my mother completely. She's never been someone to lie to me. This is a woman who once told me she felt guilty about lying to me and my brother about Santa Claus. If she said she didn't kick the door, then I believed her without question. I accepted the explanation and tried to calm myself down, though I didn't sleep very well that night. The rest of the trip passed without anything else overtly strange happening, but that feeling never left me. That sense of being watched, of something being off in that cabin, especially around my parents' room. It wasn't until the long drive home from Freiburg back to our home state that my mother brought it up again. Out of nowhere, she said something like, "How about that scary door?" I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach. I asked her if it wasn't just because the house was old and made noises, repeating the explanation she'd given me that night. She was quiet for a moment. Then she admitted the truth. She told me she had only said that to keep me calm. In reality, the bang on the door had scared the hell out of her. She said it didn't sound natural to her either. She couldn't explain it. And she admitted that she hadn't slept properly for the rest of the trip because she couldn't stop thinking about it. Hearing that shook me more than the event itself. Up until that point, a part of me had still clung to the idea that maybe I'd exaggerated it in my head. Maybe it wasn't as loud as I remembered. Maybe fear had distorted my memory, but knowing that my mother, an adult, had been just as frightened as I was and had deliberately lied to protect me, changed everything. Whether you believe me or not, I know something bad happened in that place. Something kicked that door, and it wasn't any member of my family. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it chose that moment. I don't know why it seemed tied to that room, that cabin, that place. All I know is that the fear I felt that night was real, and it's stayed with me ever since. Even now, years later, thinking about that cabin and especially my parents' room makes my skin crawl in a way I can't fully explain. Some places hold things, memories, emotions, or something darker. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you feel it before you ever understand it. I was 16 years old when my life split into a before and an after, even though at the time I didn't understand that it had happened. Looking back now, it feels unreal, like something that happened to someone else, or like a story I once read and can't quite place. But it was real, and I've carried it with me ever since. It started with a confession. Someone I knew told me that he had killed someone. The date he gave me was April 1st, April Fool's Day. We were 16, still kids in so many ways, and my mind immediately tried to protect itself by clinging to that detail. April 1st. It has to be a joke, right? A sick joke, maybe, but still a joke. I remember laughing it off at first, telling myself that no one our age could really do something like that. That belief didn't last very long. Not long after, the police contacted me. I was called into the station to talk. I remember the building feeling cold and sterile, the kind of place where your voice sounds too loud, no matter how quietly you speak. They took me into an interview room, alone. My mother was kept outside. That detail still bothers me when I think about it. I was a minor, scared, confused, and yet they isolated me anyway. The questioning didn't happen once. It happened over several days, long hours. The same questions over and over, asked in slightly different ways, like they were trying to catch me in something. At first, I answered carefully. I told them what felt safe, what I thought I could say without putting myself in danger. But the pressure kept building. Eventually, their tone changed. They told me that if I didn't tell them everything I knew, they would consider me an accomplice. They said there was no way he could have done it alone. They said my silence made me suspicious. Hearing that at 16 was terrifying. I didn't understand my rights. I didn't understand how far they could go. I just knew that suddenly I wasn't a witness anymore. I was a potential criminal. Still, I didn't tell them everything. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted to protect myself. I had a deep, instinctive fear that saying too much would put me in real danger. So I held on to that one detail in my mind like a life raft. April 1st, April Fool's Day. I kept telling myself that somehow that date meant this couldn't be as real as it felt. In the end, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. On paper, that should have been the end of it. Justice served. Case closed. Life moves on. But that's not what happened. While he was in prison, he started calling me. At first, it was just uncomfortable. Hearing his voice again made my stomach twist, but I told myself it was harmless. Then it escalated. He would call after weekends and ask me if I had fun at the club. He would tell me what I had been wearing, specific details, things he shouldn't have known. That was when fear really set in. I couldn't understand how he knew these things. Later, I realized he had read my investigation reports. Somehow he had access to information he should never have had. That realization filled me with shame and guilt. I felt exposed, like my private thoughts and statements had been laid bare for the person who scared me the most. I didn't tell anyone. I was embarrassed, ashamed. I felt stupid for not having spoken up earlier and terrified of what would happen if I spoke up now, so I stayed quiet. When I changed my phone number, he somehow got the new one within days. He would call and say things like, "You thought you got rid of me, right?" Hearing that made my blood run cold. This went on for years. Eventually, I stopped responding to his letters. I stopped answering his calls. I tried to forget about him, to push him into some dark corner of my memory where he couldn't hurt me anymore. For a while, it worked. The calls stopped. The silence felt like freedom. I started to believe it was finally over. Then one night, years later, I was out with friends and my boyfriend. When my phone rang, it was late. The caller was my old neighbor's girlfriend. Her voice sounded strange, tight with fear. She told me to sit down and take a breath before she said anything else. She told me he was at my parents' house. He was standing at their door, asking for me. She said he looked disguised somehow, like he was trying not to be recognized, and that something about him felt very wrong. My father answered the door. When my dad asked what he was doing there, the man said he had come to take me with him. Those words still echo in my head. I went straight to the police station. I told them he had escaped from prison. They laughed. They actually laughed at me. They said it was impossible. He was in a top security state prison. Nobody just escapes from a place like that. I didn't back down. I insisted they check. I pushed until they finally made a call to the prison where he was, supposed to be held. When they came back, their faces were pale. The mood in the room had completely changed. He had escaped. Not long after that, my phone rang again. It was him. This time, the police wanted me to keep him talking so they could trace his location. It was never about my safety. It was about catching him. I could hear the tension in the room, the way they leaned in, listening to every word. I didn't play along. I refused to be bait. I hung up. For days, the police set up surveillance around my parents' house. Cars parked nearby, officers watching, and of course that's when he came back. He actually got inside the house. When I saw him, something strange happened inside me. I was terrified, but at the same time, I felt eerily calm, like my body had decided panic wouldn't help and shut it down completely. My dad was with me. We told him the police were watching the house, that it would be better for him to leave. He looked at me and asked if I wanted to run away with him. I said no. I don't remember raising my voice. I don't remember shaking. I just remember saying no. He left. 2 weeks later, they caught him. Same city. He had a gun in his pocket. None of this ever made the news. There's no article you can look up. No documentary, no proof I can point to and say, see, this happened. On paper, it's like it never existed. But I live with it. I always will. Sometimes I cope with dark humor. I tell myself little jokes in my head, like how timing always seems to erase my story. How every time I write about it online, it gets buried. Like now. Maybe it's the third time I've written it on Reddit. Maybe no one will read it again because of time zones or algorithms or whatever invisible forces decide which stories get seen. But I know it happened. I know what it feels like to be 16 and interrogated for hours without your mother in the room. I know what it feels like to be threatened with becoming an accomplice just for staying silent. I know what it feels like to have someone in prison know what you're wearing on a Saturday night. I know what it feels like to have police laugh at you, only to turn pale minutes later. And I know what it feels like to look someone in the eyes, someone who once killed and who escaped to come looking for you, and calmly tell them no. There's no closure to a story like this. There's no neat ending. It doesn't fade into the past the way people like to believe trauma does. It just becomes something you carry quietly. Something that shapes the way you see safety, authority, and truth. This is something I have to live with, and whether anyone reads it or not. Whether it disappears again or not, it's real to me. This happened back in my home country, Iraq, a long time ago, when I was still very young. I was about 6 years old at the time, so most of what I know now comes from pieces I remember and things that were told to me years later. Even so, this story has stayed with my family for decades, and it's one of those things that never really fades, no matter how much time passes. My oldest brother was 18 back then. He was at that age where curiosity, pride, and recklessness mixed together. He thought he knew the world, or at least believed he was brave enough to face anything strange or forbidden. One day, he and some of his friends decided to visit an araf. In our culture, an araf is not just a simple fortune teller. This is someone who claims to deal directly with jinn, beings that exist alongside humans but are normally unseen. People go to them for answers, power, protection, or sometimes just out of curiosity, not fully understanding the consequences. According to what my family later learned, this araf did something to my brother. He unveiled a layer for him. That's how it was described. The idea is that humans normally cannot see jinn, but through certain rituals or practices, that barrier can be weakened or opened. After that, my brother was supposedly able to see the shadows of jinn. Whatever really happened there, one thing was certain. My brother was not the same afterward. He came home terrified, not scared in a normal way, but deeply shaken. He started sleeping with the lights on every single night. This was unusual for him. He was the type who liked to act tough, especially in front of his younger siblings. Seeing him afraid confused me. At that age, I had just reached a point where I could finally sleep with the lights off by myself, and I remember teasing him for being scared of the dark. I didn't understand what was going on, and no one explained it to me. To me, it just looked like my older brother had suddenly become afraid, for no reason. Our house had a very specific design, which is important to understand what happened next. The living room was in the center of the house, and all the bedrooms and other rooms were arranged around it. To go anywhere, you usually passed through or near the living room. Sounds carried easily, and movement was noticeable. One day, something happened that changed everything. My mother had just finished using the bathroom connected to the master bedroom. The lights in the bedroom were off. As she stepped out of the bathroom and looked toward her bed, she saw something sitting on it. She described it as a dark, oval-shaped figure. It wasn't human-shaped. It wasn't animal-shaped either. It was about 4 feet tall, solid in form, and completely dark, like a shadow that had weight and volume. At first, she thought something was wrong with her eyes. She had just come out of a bright bathroom into a darker room. She assumed it was a trick of the light or her vision. Adjusting, so she closed her eyes for a moment, took a breath, and opened them again. The thing was gone, but the fear didn't leave. As soon as she opened the bedroom door and stepped into the living room, my oldest brother came rushing toward her. He looked panicked. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He asked her immediately if she had seen it. My mother, still trying to stay calm, asked him what he meant. He answered without hesitation. "Jinn," he said. "He's a short little guy. He looks like an egg." Those words froze her. My mother denied seeing anything. She didn't want to encourage fear or feed into something she didn't fully understand. She went and sat down in the living room, completely silent. She didn't speak. She didn't move much. She just stared ahead, lost in thought. One of my other brothers was already sitting there. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. He asked her why her face had turned so pale, why she looked like she had just seen a ghost. That's when she finally told him what had happened in the bedroom. She explained what she saw on the bed, the dark shape, the way it disappeared. And when she described it, The description matched exactly what my oldest brother had said moments earlier. A short, dark, oval-shaped figure, like an egg. That was the moment when denial stopped being possible. As a child, I didn't know any of this. No one told me. All I knew was that my brother was afraid. My mother sometimes seemed distant, and there was a tension in the house that I couldn't understand. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I finally learned the full story. By then, I was old enough to understand the weight of it, and old enough to see how deeply it had affected everyone involved. My oldest brother is now 45 years old. Even after all these years, he is still deeply affected by what happened. Every time I try to ask him about it, his reaction is intense. He becomes angry, defensive, and visibly uncomfortable. He refuses to talk about it. He tells me never to ask him again. Sometimes he literally walks away from the conversation. It's not something he jokes about. It's not something he reflects on calmly. It's like reopening a wound that never healed. At one point, I even asked his wife if he had ever shared any details with her. She knows the story exists. She knows something happened, but she told me that he never explained it to her either. In fact, he made her promise him that she would never ask him about it again. He shut that door completely, even with the person closest to him. That, more than anything else, tells me how real it was for him. People can fake fear, people can exaggerate stories, but fear that lasts decades. Fear that turns into anger and avoidance. Fear that someone refuses to even put into words. That's something different. Whatever my brother experienced after visiting, that Araf broke something inside him. It took away his sense of safety. It took away his curiosity. It replaced it with something he didn't want to carry but couldn't get rid of. As for my mother, she rarely spoke about it. When she did, she spoke quietly, carefully, like she didn't want to give the memory too much space. She wasn't someone who believed easily in superstition. She was practical, grounded, strong, and yet she never denied what she saw. She never tried to explain it away completely. She simply accepted that something had happened, something she couldn't explain, and moved on as best she could. Looking back now, I understand why no one talked about it openly when I was a child. In our culture, things like this aren't discussed lightly, especially around children. There's a belief that attention gives power, that fear invites more fear. Silence is sometimes seen as protection, but silence also leaves questions. To this day, I don't know exactly what my brother saw after that visit. I don't know what he continued to see, or if it ever truly stopped. I don't know if what my mother saw was connected to him directly, or if it was something else entirely. I only know that one decision, one visit driven by curiosity, had consequences that followed him for the rest of his life. Some people will say it was imagination, stress, suggestion, fear feeding on fear. Others will say it was something real, something we're not meant to interact with. I don't claim to have an answer. I wasn't the one who saw the shadows. I wasn't the one who saw the shape on the bed. But I did grow up in a house where something changed. I grew up watching a strong older brother turn into someone afraid of the dark. I grew up sensing tension without knowing why. And later, as an adult, I learned that the fear had a name, a shape, and a moment when it all began. Whatever it was, it left a mark. And some marks don't fade, no matter how much time passes. I remember staying up late one night, years ago, watching cold case files on television. I was young at the time, probably around 10 years old, and I honestly shouldn't have been watching something like that so late at night. But I did, and there was one story from that show that never left me. Even now, years later, it still sits in my mind in a way that very few stories ever have. The episode was about a woman named Teresa Knorr. From the beginning, it was clear that she was not just a strict or harsh parent. She was deeply abusive. She had several children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and the way she treated them was not only cruel, but calculated. What disturbed me most, even as a child watching, was how differently she treated her daughters compared to her sons. The sons were abused too, but the daughters were treated with a special kind of hatred. As her daughters grew older, Teresa became jealous of them. Not protective, not concerned, but jealous. She saw them not as her children, but as competition. As they entered their teenage years, the abuse escalated. Beatings became more frequent and more severe. The home wasn't a place of safety. It was a place of constant fear, where the daughters never knew what would trigger the next punishment. The oldest daughter, Susan Knorr, suffered terribly. I didn't remember all the details clearly at first, because I was so young when I saw the episode. But when I later looked into the case again as an adult, the full horror became even clearer. Susan was shot by her own mother during an argument. Instead of taking her to a hospital, Teresa attempted to perform a crude, horrific surgery herself to remove the bullet. This was done in a bathtub, with no medical knowledge, no sterilization, and no concern for Susan's survival. The wound became badly infected. Susan was in agony, growing weaker by the day. When Susan didn't recover, Teresa made a decision that still feels impossible to comprehend. She tied Susan up, loaded her into a car, and drove out into the woods with her sons. There, Susan was set on fire. That was how her life ended. Her own brothers were forced to be there, forced to witness it, forced to help. The trauma of that alone is unimaginable. The second daughter, Sheila Knorr, endured a different kind of torture, prolonged and deliberate. Sheila was forced into prostitution at a young age so she could financially support the family. Teresa pulled all of her children out of school no later than the 8th grade, so teachers, counselors, or anyone else couldn't notice bruises, injuries, or signs of abuse. Sheila was beaten regularly. She was isolated. She was starved. Eventually, Teresa locked Sheila in a small closet. There was no ventilation, no light, no food, no water, no bathroom. She was left there to slowly die. Sheila didn't die quickly. She suffered alone in that confined space until her body finally gave out. Even then, she wasn't immediately removed. It was only after days passed and the smell became unbearable that Teresa unlocked the closet. By then, Sheila was long gone. Her sons were again made to help, this time burying Sheila's body. All of this was witnessed, remembered, and carried by the youngest daughter, Terry Knorr. Terry grew up watching her sisters be destroyed one by one. She saw the pattern. She saw the escalation. She knew that eventually she would be next. At one point, Terry got into an argument with her mother, and Teresa shot her as well. Unlike Susan, Terry survived, but the message was clear. Her life was disposable. Terry knew she had to escape or she would die. When she tried to leave, Teresa caught her. Instead of stopping her outright, she made a deal. She told Terry she could leave on one condition. She would allow Teresa to remove the bullet still lodged in her body. Desperate, terrified, and believing she had no other choice, Terry agreed. What followed was another horrific bathtub operation. Again, no medical care, no understanding of infection or safety. Terry developed a severe infection that nearly killed her. Somehow, she survived. And after that, Teresa let her go. Terry left home at just 16 years old. She used Sheila's identification card to pass as an adult so she could disappear and avoid being dragged back. She was injured, traumatized, and completely alone. But she was alive. For years, Terry tried to tell people what had happened. She went to police. She went to doctors. She told anyone who would listen about the abuse, the murders, and what her mother had done to her sisters. No one believed her. She was dismissed as unstable, delusional, or attention-seeking. Imagine surviving that kind of horror, carrying that truth alone and being told over and over that you were lying or insane. That part of the story is almost as painful as the abuse itself. Years passed. Terry tried to build a life, but the weight of what she had seen and lost never left her. Then one day she saw a television program about investigators reopening cold murder cases. Something clicked. She realized they might be talking about her sisters, even if they didn't know it yet. That gave her the strength to call one more time. One last attempt to be heard. This time, something was different. Investigators had found burned human remains in a wooded area. Suddenly, parts of Terry's story could be verified. Details she had shared years earlier began to line up with physical evidence. For the first time, someone took her seriously. For the first time, the truth was no longer just her word against the world. Teresa Knorr was arrested in 1993. The full scope of her crimes came to light. The murders, the abuse, the manipulation of her sons, the deliberate isolation of her daughters. The cruelty wasn't impulsive, it was systematic. Teresa was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2027 when she will be 81 years old. Shortly after finally being believed, after finally seeing justice begin to take shape, Terry Knorr died. That part has always haunted me the most. She spent her entire life carrying unbearable trauma, trying to tell the truth, trying to honor her sisters, trying to survive what never should have happened to her. And when the world finally listened, when her story was no longer dismissed, she didn't get to live long enough to experience peace or closure. I know I may have mixed up or forgotten some details when I first remembered this story, because I was a child when I saw it. But revisiting it later only made it more horrifying, not less. This wasn't just a crime story. It was a story about how evil can hide behind closed doors, how systems fail victims, and how easily truth can be ignored when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. What stayed with me all these years wasn't just what Teresa did, it was what happened to Terry afterward. How she screamed the truth into a void for years, how no one protected her, how no one believed her, and how that kind of disbelief can be almost as damaging as the abuse itself. Some stories don't fade. They don't become just another episode you watched late at night. They stay with you, growing heavier as you get older and understand them more clearly. This was one of those stories for me. Even now, thinking about it makes my chest feel tight. It's the kind of evil that doesn't make sense, the kind that leaves scars far beyond the people directly involved. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the crime itself, but how long it can take for the truth to finally be heard. When I was a little girl, my family lived in a 2-story house that always felt wrong to me in a way I could never fully explain. From the very beginning, there was something about that place that made my skin crawl, even during the daytime. I remember telling my parents over and over that the house felt haunted, that something wasn't right. But they never took me seriously. To them, it was just an old house with normal noises, and I was just a kid with a big imagination. But to me, the house felt alive in a quiet, unsettling way, like it was always watching, always listening. What made it even stranger was how different our house felt compared to the rest of the street. We lived on a normal residential road with working streetlights, but for some reason, the light never seemed to reach our house. At night, everything around us would glow softly except our front yard and porch, which stayed swallowed in darkness. No matter how bright the streetlights were, it was always pitch black around our home, as if the light simply stopped at the edge of our property. Even as a child, that detail stuck with me. It felt intentional, like the darkness belonged there. Inside the house, the atmosphere never felt calm. The kitchen sink was one of the worst parts. It had this constant dripping sound that echoed through the house, especially at night when everything else was quiet. My parents had it fixed more than once, and plumbers would say there was nothing wrong or that the issue was resolved. But the dripping always came back. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, slow, and impossible to ignore. Lying in bed at night, I could hear it faintly, like a ticking clock counting down to something I didn't understand. My bedroom was at the very top of the stairs, which only made things worse. The staircase was narrow and creaky, and at night, the sounds carried easily. Some nights, when everyone else was asleep, I would hear footsteps moving up and down the stairs. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just my parents or the house settling, but the sounds never matched what I knew. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, not rushed or casual. Sometimes they would stop halfway up the stairs, as if someone was standing there, listening. Other times, the steps would continue all the way up, and I could swear they sounded like they were coming straight toward my bed. I would lie there, frozen under the covers, too scared to move, waiting for the sounds to stop. One incident that still stands out clearly happened when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I had gotten really sick enough that I stayed home from school, and my mom stayed with me. We spent most of the day upstairs in the living room, watching TV and resting. The house was quiet in that way it gets when only 2 people are home, almost too quiet. At some point, my mom realized the air conditioning was still running downstairs and asked me to go turn it off. I remember walking down the stairs slowly, not because I was scared at first, but because I still felt weak from being sick. Halfway down, there was a small landing where you could lean over the railing and see most of the downstairs area. From that spot, you could see into the living room, the kitchen, and down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom. For reasons I still don't understand, I felt this sudden urge to look over the railing. It was like something pulled my attention there. When I leaned over and looked, I noticed my parents' bedroom door was slightly open. That alone wasn't strange, but something about it made my stomach drop. As I stared at the door, it slowly opened all the way on its own. There was no breeze, no sound of movement, nothing that explained it. I knew for a fact that it was just me and my mom in the house. The moment the door fully opened, panic hit me all at once. I screamed and ran back up the stairs as fast as I could, my heart pounding, tears already streaming down my face. When I reached my mom, I tried to explain what I saw, talking over myself because I was so scared. She listened but brushed it off almost immediately. She told me I was probably just seeing things because I was sick, that my imagination was getting the best of me. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. That feeling stayed with me long after that day. Another experience happened late one night and disturbed me in a completely different way. My dad worked very early mornings, so he usually left the house around 3 o'clock in the morning. He never went upstairs before leaving, but I always knew when he left because our alarm system made a short beeping sound as he armed it. One night, I remember hearing the familiar beep, knowing my dad had just left for work. I rolled over and fell back asleep shortly after. Not long later, I woke up suddenly to a strange sensation on my face. It felt like a kiss, but not a normal one. It was cold and slightly wet, enough to shock me awake. For a moment, I was confused and disoriented, but then fear crept in. I lay there barely breathing, too scared to move or open my eyes again. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell back asleep. The next morning, the memory of it was still vivid. I asked my mom if she had come upstairs that night to kiss me, thinking maybe she had checked on me. She looked confused and told me no, she hadn't. When my dad came home from work later, I asked him the same thing. He also said no and reminded me that he never went upstairs before leaving. That answer left me with a question I still can't fully answer. If it wasn't my mom and it wasn't my dad, then who kissed me while I slept? The most terrifying experience of all happened when I was even younger, probably around 5 years old. It was one of those nights where a storm felt unusually intense. Thunder shook the house and lightning flashed so brightly that every strike lit up the rooms like a camera flash. I was already scared, so I grabbed my nightlight and carried it down the hallway to my older sister's room. I plugged it in beside her bed and climbed in with her, hoping I'd feel safer. My sister had left her bedroom door open and my face was turned toward it. Beyond the doorway was nothing but darkness. The hallway light was off, and the storm outside only made the shadows deeper. I pulled the blanket over my head but left a small hole so I could breathe and peek out if I needed to. Eventually, I closed my eyes, trying to block everything out. A loud crash of thunder suddenly jolted me awake. My heart was racing as I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw it. Through the small opening in the blanket, a pale white face was staring directly at me. The face looked unnatural, almost glowing against the darkness. One eye, a sharp, piercing blue, was fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. My body felt completely frozen, like my fear had locked me in place. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, though it was probably around 30 seconds. Every second stretched unbearably long. Then, slowly, I saw more of it. A white, pale, almost transparent body rose up and turned away from the bed. It moved calmly out of the room and disappeared into the pitch-black hallway. Only after it was gone did I realize I was shaking uncontrollably. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the doorway, terrified it would come back. I never told my parents about that night. Even at that age, I somehow knew they wouldn't believe me. Years passed, and eventually, when I was in high school, my family moved out of that house. I thought leaving would bring relief, but the memories followed me. I still thought about the darkness, the footsteps, the door, the kiss, and that pale face in the hallway. Curiosity eventually pushed me to look into the history of the house. I started researching it on my own, not really expecting to find anything concrete. What I discovered sent chills through me. An elderly woman had died in that house years before we lived there. The worst part was learning where she had died. It was in the very room I slept in as a child. When I showed my parents what I found, they finally went quiet. For the first time, they didn't dismiss me or laugh it off. They believed me. That was the moment everything clicked into place. All those experiences I had tried to forget suddenly made sense in a way that was both terrifying and validating. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. That house had been haunted, and whatever was there had made itself known to me when I was too young to understand it. Even now, years later, those memories still feel vivid, and sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I swear I can still hear footsteps on the stairs. There are a few moments in life that stay with you forever, no matter how many years pass or how many times people tell you that you must be remembering it wrong. Some memories just settle deep inside you and refuse to fade. This story is one of those memories for me, something I've held on to since childhood. And even though most of the people I've told over the years haven't believed me, some laughed, some politely nodded, some said I must have imagined it, I know with absolute certainty what happened. I was there, I felt it, and I've spent my entire life defending it to myself and to others. I was around 8 or 9 years old at the time. At that age, kids usually have wild imaginations, and I wasn't any different. I created stories in my head, played pretend games, made whole worlds out of cardboard boxes and blankets. But what I'm about to share wasn't imagination. It wasn't a dream or a moment of childish confusion. It was real. I've never doubted it, not even for a second, not even when people tried to convince me otherwise. To understand the moment, I have to start with the place where it happened, my grandmother's house. I lived on the same road as her for most of my life, so I spent countless days and nights there. That house wasn't just old, it was ancient, the kind of structure that feels like it's lived more lives than the people inside it. It had been standing long before my grandmother moved in with my grandfather. It's where my father grew up with his 4 siblings, 2 older brothers, 1 younger brother, and 1 younger sister. All of them were raised within those walls, which made the house feel even more alive, as if the laughter and fights and memories of generations were still hanging in the air. The house was massive, not just big, massive in a way that seems almost unreal for the era in which it was built. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 staircases if you counted the small one in the back, and hallways that stretched longer than you'd expect. Houses weren't typically built that large back then, at least not for ordinary families. There was something regal about it, even though it wasn't fancy or modern. It had a quiet grandeur, the kind that made you lower your voice when you walked through it, even if you didn't know why. The centerpiece of the house was the main staircase. It started in the front hallway and rose upward in a long, dramatic flight. It wasn't steep enough to be dangerous on its own, but it was long, at least 15 or 20 steps. The wooden railing was thick and smooth from years of hands sliding along it, and the steps creaked in familiar ways. At the top of the stairs, the hallway branched into several bedrooms and a bathroom. If you kept walking, you reached another hallway with more rooms and another bathroom. This was the area where my experience took place. I remember that day like it happened yesterday. The lighting, the hallway, the faint smell of something cooking downstairs. Every detail is burned into my memory. I was upstairs with my mother and grandmother. We had all been in the far master bedroom for some reason. I can't recall what we were doing there, maybe looking for something or helping organize the room, but my grandmother had been using that room at the time. I walked out ahead of them about 5 to 10 feet in front and started down the hallway toward the top of the staircase. That's when it happened. I don't know how to describe the feeling that came over me except to say that it was unlike anything I have ever felt before or since. It was as if something, some force, some presence, some invisible warmth flowed through my entire body all at once. I felt weightless, as light as air. My chest expanded with confidence so intense it didn't feel normal for a child. It was like my mind briefly stepped aside and something else took hold. Something that made me feel unstoppable, as if I could do anything in the world. And then, before I even fully knew what I was doing, my body started to move on its own. It wasn't a decision. I didn't think about running. I didn't think about jumping. My legs just did it. I broke into a full sprint toward the staircase. I wasn't scared. I wasn't confused. I wasn't even aware enough to question what was happening. That strange euphoria, light, weightless, fearless, pushed me forward. When I reached the top of the staircase, I jumped. A normal fall would have been disastrous. That staircase was long. Falling down, it would have meant broken bones at best. But as soon as my feet left the floor, the weightlessness didn't fade. It intensified. I felt suspended in the air as if gravity had loosened its grip on me. I didn't drop. I didn't tumble. Instead, I floated. That's the only word that fits. I floated down the staircase. I drifted at a slow, gentle speed, my feet barely touching anything. There was no fear, no pain, no shock. When I reached the bottom, I didn't crash or stumble. I touched down softly on the second to last step, the way a feather settles on a surface. The moment my feet touched the wood, everything snapped back to normal. The strange sensation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The hallway above me looked ordinary again. The staircase felt long and tall. The air around me felt heavy again, real again. I was breathless. not from exertion, just from shock. My mind began racing to catch up to what had happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. I turned and ran back up the stairs, my heart pounding. I reached the top just as my mother and grandmother were starting to walk down the hallway. I practically shouted, "I just flew down the stairs!" They both looked at me like they weren't sure whether to laugh, scold me, or worry about me. My mom frowned and said something like, "Don't be silly," and my grandmother gently told me not to run on the stairs. They didn't believe me, not even a little, but it didn't matter. I knew what I had felt. I knew what had happened. And even though I was only 8 or 9, I knew it wasn't hallucination or imagination. It wasn't pretend. My body had floated. I had been lifted, carried by something I still can't explain. As the years passed, I told the story to people I trusted, friends, a few relatives, a couple of people who I thought might understand. The reactions were always mixed. Some shrugged it off as childhood exaggeration. Some said maybe I had dreamt it. Some didn't say anything but gave me a polite nod that told me they didn't believe me at all. Eventually, the constant disbelief wore me down. I stopped telling the story. I didn't need validation. I knew the truth. But it's exhausting defending something that feels so vivid and real to people who've decided not to believe you no matter what. For a long time, I tucked the memory away. It was still there, untouched and powerful, but I didn't talk about it. It became a private part of my past. Then, years later, long after I'd stopped expecting anyone to understand, I had a conversation with my grandmother that brought everything rushing back. We were talking about the supernatural. She knew I had always been interested in things that couldn't be explained. Maybe she sensed I wanted to revisit the topic, or maybe she just felt like sharing something. Out of nowhere, she said, "Did I ever tell you about the lady with the candle at the top of the stairs?" I stared at her. The words landed in my chest like a punch. I wasn't sure what to say. I was afraid she was trying to feed into my old story, to give me something symbolic or comforting. But as she continued talking, her voice didn't sound like she was humoring me. She sounded serious, almost troubled. She told me that when her youngest daughter, my aunt, was little, she used to draw pictures of a lady in a white gown holding a candle. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. This figure always stood at the top of the staircase in the drawings. My aunt said she had seen this woman many times, felt her presence, sometimes standing still, sometimes watching, sometimes just there. My grandmother described the drawings in detail. My aunt would draw the gown, the candle, the faint glow around it. She was a child at the time, maybe 5 or 6, but the drawings were consistent. Always the lady, always the stairs. I didn't want to get my hopes up. I didn't want to assume anything. So later I went to my aunt directly. I asked her if the story was true, trying to keep my tone neutral. She didn't laugh. She didn't hesitate. She confirmed it immediately. She remembered drawing the pictures. She remembered seeing the woman. She remembered a presence near the top of the stairs. Not harmful, but powerful, unmistakable. And the place she said she felt it the strongest? Right where I had jumped. Hearing that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't proof, it wasn't an explanation, but it was alignment, something that made the pieces fall into a pattern that suddenly felt less random. I don't claim to know what happened to me that day. I don't know whether the woman with the candle was connected to my experience. I don't know whether she had been protecting me, guiding me, or simply passing through. I don't know why I felt weightless, why I floated, why I jumped without choosing to. But I know this. It happened. I can still feel that strange lightness in my bones when I think about it. I can still picture the stairway, the hallway, the shock of landing so softly. I can still hear myself shouting for my mom and grandmother, not caring whether they believed me. The memory hasn't faded. It hasn't softened. It's as sharp and clear as it was the day it happened. People can believe me or not. That's their choice. But I know what I lived through in that old house. And somewhere, deep down, I think that lady with the candle knows too. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments. And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives.